One is my translation of this Buddhist Gatha. The other is your translations of your Buddhist Sutra. Now, between the two topics, I think the more important one is the second one, your translations. However, I want to start with this one first because I want to cover some theory that I'm going to be using when I'm discussing your translations. So I'll get at least the theory part of this, and afterwards, whether or not we look at my translation is not as important. Let's get started on this. So a brief outline. I'm going to begin with an introduction about the purpose and process of my translation of this Gatha, keeping in mind that I'm not an expert in Buddhist matters. I'll talk a little bit about the background of the source text and the context of the Gatha. Then we'll perform a textual analysis and talk about some translation strategies. And most likely we will stop here and go look at your sutras first, and then come back to section number 6 if we have time at the very end. Okay, my initial encounter of this sutra was because my wife, who's sitting here, is a big fan of the Bodhisattva, and this Gatha is something that often appears at the very beginning of the Bodhisattva. So she introduced me to it and asked if I would be interested in translating it. And to me, it was something that was really interesting because it had certain elements that somebody in my field of literature and linguistics would be interested in. There was a lot of metaphor in this Gatha. It talks about the nature of reality, which I have encountered in my other translations of Buddhist works. And it lends itself well to comparative work between different traditions, such as New Age or Christianity or parapsychology. So that's the type of work that I was interested in doing. I started translating this work in, I think it was early 2016, and finished it in 2017. So it was published last summer in this journal over here. When I published it, I actually published a translation plus 4 variations on this translation. I'll talk about the variations a little bit later. And it was a very interesting Gatha to translate. I really enjoy translating these short poetic verses of this sort because it's something that I can think about at all times. It's the kind of thing I think about when I go to bed, or when I'm waiting for the bus, or when I'm taking the kid to the playground who's playing around. I have these Gathas playing in my head and I'm thinking about how to translate stuff. Okay, so this Gatha comes from the Alatamsaka Sutra. It appears in both the 60-fascicle Chinese version of the sutra and also the 80-fascicle version. It doesn't appear in the 40-fascicle version. Now, I am told that there is also a Tibetan version of it, but I have not had the chance to see it. Now, within the, or I guess to take the 80-fascicle Avatamsaka Sutra as an example, a lot of you are probably familiar with this, but you have 39 chapters, and you have 7 locations, and you have 9 meetings. And this Gatha appears in meeting number 4 in Siyama Heaven, which occupies chapters 19 to 22. This Gatha actually appears in chapter 20. Okay, and the thing that comes before it is this description over here. It's basically a description of how at a certain time you have all the different bodhisattvas from the 10 different directions gathered at this place. And to give you an English translation of it, I go to the Thomas Cleary translation. These are the names of the different Buddhas: the forest of virtue, the forest of wisdom, victory, fearlessness, conscience, energy, power, practice, awareness, and knowledge. And they come from these different lands of infinite wisdom, symbolic wisdom, jewel wisdom, supreme wisdom, lamp wisdom, and you get the idea. And they each have some special powers, such as eternal eye, invincible eye, non-dwelling eye, for example. And the one that we're interested in is number 9, the Bodhisattva forest of awareness, who comes from the land of clear wisdom, who has the special power of supreme eye. And it is this Bodhisattva that issues the Gatha that we're going to be translating. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that there are 2 different versions of this, one from the 60-fascicle sutra, the other from the 80-fascicle version, and the differences are given here. So in the first, I've highlighted the differences in blue, and in the second version, the areas in red. because a lot of these are basically different turns of phrases, different ways of expressing the same idea. If you compare them, you will see that some of the differences are these. Both make reference to the Mahabhuta, the four great elements. In the 60 fascicle version, it's referred to as the Sida, or Siddha, the four great, whereas in the 80 fascicle version, it's called the Dazhou, the great elements. Okay, when referring to the five skandhas, the earlier version uses the earlier term yin, and the later version uses the later term yun, which is a more literal translation of the five aggregates. When talking about the relationship between mind and flesh, the 60 fascicle version says, 心意非是身，身意非是心. So one is not the other is not the one. Whereas the 80 fascicle version has 心不住于身，身意不住心. And depending on how you interpret the verb 住, it can mean to reside in, or it can mean to hold back. So something like the mind does not reside in the body, and the body does not hold back the mind. And other minor lexical difference, such as you have 有如工画师 in the first version, when you have 譬如工画师 in the second version. So most of the differences are fairly minor. It's more or less talking about the same thing. And in my translation, for the most part, I use the later version from the 80 fascicle Avatamsaka Sutra. Okay, so let's perform an analysis of the text before we attempt a translation. First, let's look at the formal features of the text. The text is divided into different lines. Each line is of a fixed length, as is the case in most Chinese poetry. So each line is syllable timed. This is characteristic of Chinese, whereas English tends to be stress timed. The line length is 5 syllables or 5 characters per line, and then the lines are grouped into units that I'll call stanzas over here. Each stanza has 4 lines, and other than the fixed line length, there is no other adhesive device to hold the stanza together. So for example, there is no rhyme. This is the formal structure of the Gatha. In terms of the information structure, you could say that the Gatha deals with these issues. The first is reality as a creation of the mind. The second is about the mind's creative ability being infinite. The third is about the mind not being conscious of its own creative ability. And the fourth is about the point of emancipation. If we go to the first topic, reality as a creation of the mind, this is a message that is echoed throughout the verse. In stanza 1, you have a statement about how reality is imagined and created by the mind. And then in stanza 2, you have something about how the elements of reality are imagined. In stanza 3, you have something about reality being immaterial. And then in stanza 10, you have something about time and space being imagined. Okay, the mind's infinite creative ability is mentioned in stanzas 4, 6, and 7. The mind not being conscious is mentioned explicitly in stanza 5 and implied throughout. And then emancipation is mentioned explicitly in stanza 9, where the verse talks about the mind not being tied to the body and the boundless joy that you get when you realize this. And then in stanzas 8 and 10, you have statements about awareness of the imagined nature of reality. So this is more or less what the Gatha is about. Now, there are some core metaphors that appear throughout the Gatha. The first has to do with the use of an artist using pigment to paint a picture. So there's 3 parts to this metaphor. The first part is the artist, the second part is the pigment, the third part is the picture. The artist is being compared to the mind. The pigment is being compared to the 4 great elements that reality is made out of. And then the picture is a metaphor for reality. So when the poet is talking about the artist and pigment and picture, he's really talking about the mind and material elements and reality. In stanzas 1 through 3, you have the artist visualizing an image. In stanzas 4, 6, and 7, you have talk about the artist having this infinite creative capability. And in stanza number 5, you have the artist being unaware of the creative process. Hence, statements about the painting being compared to reality appears in stanzas 1, 2, and 3, where there is talk about the image being virtual, about the image being manifest via the pigments, but the image itself not existing within the pigments. And then you have talk about how the image is created by the mind, but you won't find the image within the mind. Okay, the second main metaphor is the metaphor of mind as Buddha. So in stanza 8, you have a statement about how the mind is able to create infinite worlds, and the Buddha can do the same, so the mind is the Buddha. You have talk about how the ability of the Buddha is infinite, and so is the ability of the mind. In stanza 9, you have talk about how the Buddha is not tied to anything physical, and the mind is not either, so the two are the same thing. And then in stanza 10, you have talk about the Buddha not being limited to time, space, and the same goes for the mind. So these are the ideas that we want to try to represent when we're translating this text. We have on the one hand 2 metaphors, and we have on the other hand the main ideas that we want to get through. Okay, so when I do my transformation, this is what I ended opting for. In terms of line length, because I'm translating into English, I had to convert the syllable timing into stress timing, which is more characteristic of the English poetic tradition. So everything would have to be determined by a stress pattern. As for lines per stanza, I was able to keep it the same, 4 lines per stanza, because you have the same structure in both English and Chinese. But because a stress time pattern is a little looser than a syllable times pattern, there is less cohesion between the different lines. I decided to add an additional adhesive, which is to give it rhyme to tie the 4 lines together. Okay, now the theoretical aspect. To explain what I do here, I would like to introduce a little more of Scopus theory, and then a little bit about the cultural turn in translation, and then a little from linguistics about the use of schemas, frames, and scripts. Okay, first let's return to our familiar Scopus theory. In Scopus theory, there is talk about fact versus reality, and the two being different. This is kind of interesting because in a lot of the sutras we're translating, and also in this verse, they talk about the same thing. But here when I talk about fact versus reality, I'm talking about translation theory and not Buddhism. In this theory, fact refers to an objective historical event, whereas reality is the historical event as viewed through certain prisms. These prisms are, for example, the cultural refractions that we talked about earlier. So you could have the same fact, but different realities because they're perceived through different lenses by different people. So an identical material, if inserted into different lives, may have the most diverse realities. Think about something like the 4th of July that we just celebrated. It's a wonderful holiday through American eyes. Through British eyes, it's probably not that great. It's the day when they lost the American colonies, right? So same event, same historical facts, different lens. So in Vermeer and Rice's book, they say that humans cannot perceive objective reality. What we perceive is only how objects appear to us. Now, given this state of affairs, what is the translator's role? The translator's role is to translate realities, not facts. Keeping in mind that a reality is a fact viewed through a particular cultural refraction. Therefore, in order to become a successful translator, you need to know how that fact is refracted through the lens of the source language audience, and also how it will be refracted through the lens of the target language audience. So translators must be able to view fact through both SL and TR refractions. Translators must therefore know both source and target culture. They must be bicultural. And this, I think, is very important. Okay, now a little bit about the cultural turn. What is the cultural turn? To understand what this is, you need to understand what the cultural turn is the opposite of. The opposite of the cultural turn, I guess you could say, is the linguistic turn. Or you could also say that there was never a linguistic turn, so there's a linguistic approach and a cultural approach. Earlier theories of translation focused on the linguistic approach. Later theories of translation are against the linguistic approach, and what they're adopting is a cultural approach. Okay, let's first begin by saying what the linguistic approach is. The linguistic approach is one that has a source orientation. It tends to treat the source text as the primary thing, as something that's more important. And its focus is on equivalence between different linguistic units. So I'm sure you have this experience when you're translating. You look at the source text, you analyze the structure of the sentence, and you think about how the meaning embedded in the sentence can be transferred into a sentence in another language, let's say English. So the transfer of meaning from one language to another, preserving its meaning, this is a focus on linguistics, on linguistic units. This is the linguistic approach. And by using this approach, people often emphasize quality, universal standards of quality and accuracy. Now, since the 1990s, or you could say late 80s and 1990s, however, there has been a backlash against this linguistic approach and an approach that favors culture. Using this cultural approach, the emphasis is more on the target, on the reader and the audience. In this approach, there is the belief that everything is heavily dependent on context. So we're not just translating this sentence or this passage. What we're more interested in is where this passage appears in. What's the situational context? What's the cultural context? What is it being used for? That's more important than the actual words themselves. And as to how we view translation, well, translation is not so much just transferring meaning from one to the other. It's more of an act of rewriting, reconstruction, and ideological manipulation. So translation is more about politics and power relations than it is about language, according to this view. Okay, let's look a little more at this. Translation is heavily dependent upon context. What does this mean? So what is studied here is the text embedded within its network of both source and target cultural science. So what's more important than the text itself is what happens to the text if you put it in this environment for these readers. Would it be different if you put the same thing in this environment for these readers? And if it's different, then what changes do we have to make in order for you to get the same effect? And earlier I talked about genres and textual grids in reference to acceptable literary forms and genres. Okay, this is also something that's very important in this approach. We have to know what the different patterns of expectation are that have been interiorized by members of a given culture. Now, translation as viewed through this approach is an act of rewriting, reconstruction, and ideological manipulation. So think about it. When you're translating the text, in a way, you're shaping the image and status of that text, right? When you're translating a Buddha Sutra, are you trying to make it seem a little positive, or are you trying to make it seem more negative? You have the power to do both, right? Easily, through the choice of words, you can make it seem like something that is respectful, something that is respected, or something that is looked down upon. The same for an author. Some people may like an author, some people may hate an author. Some people may be trying to put the author in a more positive light. Some people may be trying to put him in a less positive light. And by doing that, you are manipulating the ideology. The same goes for language and people. Now, this is more apparent when you have translation between different languages or different cultures that are not of equal status. Let's say you have a formal colonial power that colonized another area, another people speaking a different language. Now, the way the colonized people view this same text would be different from the way the colonizing culture would view it. So this would affect how the text is received. And in this view, translation is affected by politics and power relations. Power relations between the source and target languages and cultures, like I mentioned before, and also the translator's attitude towards the source and target cultures. Also, who is the patron of the translation? Okay, to give another example, you're being asked to come here to the city of 10,000 Buddhas to translate these Buddhist texts, right? Do you feel any obligation to the city of 10,000 Buddhas? Do you think you have to translate it in a certain way? Do you feel you cannot translate it in a certain way? don't know, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But according to this approach, whoever your patron is would have some effect on how you choose to translate the text, or even which text you choose to translate. Why is it the Sutra of Vimalakirti that you're being asked to translate, and why another one? This is all part of patronage. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the use of schemas, frames, and scripts. This has to do with how we understand the meaning of words. When we understand the meaning of words, we don't understand the meaning of single words. Rather, we understand the word as being part of a larger unit of ideas. And very often you have to understand that bigger idea before you can truly understand the meaning of this word. In fact, you have to understand how the people of the source language culture understand this idea or what bigger idea they have. And then you have to understand for the target language culture whether they have the same idea or if it's a different idea in order to make the meaning of this word transfer. Okay, to give some simple examples, think about the meaning of the word to buy. You all know what to buy means, right? To understand what to buy means, you would also have to understand the notion of paying for something, and the notion of selling something, and the meaning of charging a certain price. It's all part of this network of meaning that buying is part of. On the other hand, if you come from a culture that did not use cash, then this would be a lot harder to explain. So a sentence with the word to buy will be easier to translate between two cultures that have cash and have these commercial transactions than between one that has it and one that doesn't. And this can get more complicated. It can become something like a script. Let's take a look at this passage over here. Sue caught a plane from London to Paris. After she had found her seat, she checked whether the life vest was beneath it, but she could not find it. So she asked the flight attendant. Look at the two thes. She checked whether the life vest was beneath it. Could I have said she checked whether a life vest was beneath it? What's the difference between using the and using a here? Exactly. And usually in English you would use the if something was mentioned before, or when both the speaker and the listener both know that that stuff is supposed to be there. In this case, this hasn't been mentioned before, so this is something that the listener, you assume, automatically knows about, right? Why would the listener know that the life vest is supposed to be there? Because you're assuming that the listener has taken a plane before. Everybody knows that there's a life vest under the seat. Everybody knows that there's a flight attendant on the plane. However, if you're talking to somebody that has never taken a plane before, then the picture might be different, right? Let's try something like this. Sue caught a Hyperloop from Los Angeles to San Francisco. After she had found her seat, she checked whether the Mosconian transponder was beneath it, but she could not find it, so she asked the Dravardian beamer. Okay, now we don't have Hyperloops yet, so we have no idea what's under the seat of a Hyperloop. So this becomes a lot more confusing because I don't really know if the Mosconian transponder, whatever that is supposed to be there or not. And what is the Dravardian beamer? Is it somebody who's always on the Hyperloop? Or is it just some other passenger that happened to be standing next to Sue? It could be any of these things, right? So everything changes when you don't have a shared schema, a shared cultural understanding, which is why it's important to know what schemas are in the head of the audience and in the head of the author before you translate. Okay, let's talk a little more about schemas. And to understand schemas a little better, we need to know about prototypes, we need to know about sense relations, and we need to introduce schemas yet again. Let me do this using a few examples. Let me give you this example here. Try to visualize this next thing in your head. A loop which proceeds in 2 dimensions with a rotational component and the component going transverse to that direction. Can you imagine what I'm trying to describe here? Okay. A wheel? Okay.
It's in 2 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be a wheel.
So it proceeds in 2 dimensions. So you have motion in 2 dimensions, and these 2 dimensions are transverse to each other. So the point here is it's kind of difficult to picture, right? Let me give it to you another way. Picture a slinky. Can you picture a slinky? Spiral going this way? Is the second one easier or is the first one easier? The second one is easier because you already know what a slinky is. You already have that picture in your head. Whereas in the first one, you have to build it step by step. Now, my point here is when you're introducing concepts like this, it's a lot easier if you know that your listener already has Slinky in their head. You can go straight to Slinky rather than having to use its components to build something which they might not succeed in building. Okay, this is an example of how we could better use schemas in translation rather than just Aristotelian logic. Now, prototype. Let's do a few experiments. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. I want you to picture this. There was a bird in the yard. Everybody knows what this means, right? Okay? So, you have a picture of this in your head? So, let me ask somebody. Let's begin with you. There's a bird in the yard. The bird that you're picturing, is it an ostrich? Is it a penguin? Is it a vulture? Okay, so these are all birds. The word bird actually is a category that includes a lot of different images, but these are not the images that you would choose. What kind of bird? A crow. Okay, good. So, you tend to pick the more typical birds, the birds that are most typical in your culture as the thing to visualize when you're doing this. And I'm pretty sure that not everybody pictured a crow, right? In fact, if you grew up in different places, if you're from different cultures, you would picture a different type of bird. So psycholinguists have done this experiment before. People in England tend to picture a robin. People from Asia tend to picture something like a sparrow. So it's the most typical bird in your culture. So what this goes to show is that even though we have the same sentence that everybody can understand, the picture that shows up in your head would be different according to the culture that you're from. It's very different. And context dependency. If I were to say, we stuffed the bird with onion, lemon, garlic, and herbs, would it still be the crow? No. What would you have now? Okay, you would probably have a duck or a turkey, right? So once you change the context, then your prototype changes. So it's important to know what the prototype is in that context and what the prototype is in that culture. Now, visualize this sentence. They found a bug in the computer. What kind of bug did they find?
Well, is it like a virus bug or like a cockroach in the computer? Right? Bug means different things.
Okay. In English, bug can mean different things. It can mean at least 3 types of things. It could be an actual insect. It could be a fault in the computer. It could be a spying device in the computer, right? Now translate this into Chinese for me. You can give me the Chinese equivalent. Okay? 电脑里有一只虫. So you don't have the 3 meanings anymore. You're limited to just 1. In fact, whereas in English, perhaps all 3 could have been possible, you're forced to just choose the most likely one and go with that, right? Now, let's take your Chinese sentence. 电脑里有一只虫. Oh, wait. No, let's try something different. Oh, and another thing I wanted to say is, let's try this one. They found a bug in the apple. Okay. Do you have the same bug or the different bug as in the computer? Okay.
It's an
if it's written or if it's spoken, now it's hard to tell because written down we can tell that it's a piece of fruit, but if you speak it, it could be a
Oh, I
computer
see.
as well.
Yes. Yeah. The apple could have been a computer, huh? I missed that. Oh, wait. But that would have been a capital for the Apple computer. Yeah, I see what you mean. Suppose we're talking about the fruit thing. So they found a bug in the apple. Okay, I want you to picture that. And can I go back to you again? How would you say they found a bug in the apple? George. Okay. Now, those of you that know Chinese, picture this sentence, Chinese sentence in your head. 他们在苹果里找到一只虫. Can you picture that? Okay. 哪一种虫? Yeah. Like the worm? Okay. And those of you that read it in the English, they found a bug in the apple. What kind of bug did you picture? What? See, that's the problem. In Chinese, the 虫 includes both worms and bugs. But in English, I'm not so sure that a worm is a bug. A bug is something that is more round and has 6 legs, where that's the more typical bug. So if you come from a Chinese culture, the 虫 that you think of would be very different from the typical bug that you would if you were speaking English. And this is something for a sentence as simple as they found a bug in the apple. Imagine if it was something more complex. So this goes to show the effect of prototypes when you're translating. Okay, so I guess this would be a good place to stop on this topic. Are people ready to move on to the next one and look at the translations of the sutra? Let's do that first. Okay, so first a quick outline of what I plan to do here. I'm going to start with, I imagine this to be some sort of translator training. So 2 of the more common approaches to translator training I want to talk about. Then I'll talk about the process, and I'll talk about the product. Okay, when it comes to translator training, in the modern classification, we usually talk about a difference between a product-oriented approach and a process-oriented approach. A product-oriented approach is when I look at your end translation, what you translated, and start to critique it. That's one way I can talk about your translations. Another way I could do it is I could ask you about the process and not focus so much on the product. Traditional teaching tends to use the first approach a little more often. Look at what you turn in and then grade it. The more modern approach tends to focus on the second, which is to talk more about the process rather than the product. Today I'm going to talk about both, but I'm going to start with the process first and then talk about the product. They both have pros and cons, which I'll go over really quickly. Okay, the traditional product-oriented approach, the pros of that is that I can identify the problems really quickly, and then I can really quickly produce a good product. So if efficiency is your goal, then this is the easier way to do it. But this approach does have its cons, which is that it produces correct answers, but it doesn't tell you how the correct answers are arrived at. So the second time you're doing the same thing again, when you're translating again, you still don't know how to get at the correct answer or the better way to translate. This approach also offers little insight as to how students are thinking. And the student may not agree with the instructor over the correct answer. The student may even feel belittled and attacked. Now, when you take a process-oriented approach, which has been around since the 1970s, the pros are you get insight as to how the correct answers are arrived at. You also get better insight into the problem triggers, and the teacher can be less critical of students, and therefore we can still be friends. There will be less animosity between you and I when I point out this and say, hey, I don't like the way this thing is translated. It will also produce a greater urge to learn. The cons of this is that it's extremely time consuming. If your purpose is to get a nice translation out fast, then this is probably not the fastest way to do it. Okay, the basic philosophy of a process-oriented approach, however, is that students are here to learn the process rather than the product. I don't know if that's the case here. What's more important to you? The way you're translating or the product that you're producing? Yeah.
The process.
The process? Okay.
That's the process.
You tend to use this approach when the quality of the end product doesn't matter so much. There's no pressure to produce a good product in a limited amount of time. I don't know if that's the case here. The end product is usually used only to look for methodological weaknesses. Okay, in this training regimen, in a process-oriented regimen, what the teacher does is usually provide a norm for the process, not the product. So let's say if I'm using the process-oriented approach to teach you, I'm not necessarily better than you are. If I were to translate the same thing, there's no guarantee that I can produce a better translation, but you can look at how I'm doing it, and hopefully some of the methods that I'm using would be useful to you. So the teacher will not offer to correct or criticize the end product. The teacher will let the student discover the problem for himself. And the teacher may question this process. Why this choice? Did you consider other alternatives? Are you satisfied with the end product? In fact, when a lot of translation teachers use this approach, the teacher himself might not even know your language. So I've seen teachers, let's say, speakers of Dutch and English and French, teaching people who are translating from Chinese to Japanese. They basically point out the process, let the students critique each other, and the students do get something out of it. Okay, and these processes are usually supported by theoretical models, which explain and integrate them. Okay, so this is the piece that you've been asked to translate, right? Let's look at some of the things we'll want to consider. Just to get a sense, before you started translating this piece, how many of you were fully familiar with this work? You have read it before? Anybody? Okay. How many of you know a little bit about it, but are not fully familiar? Okay. And is there anybody starting from scratch? Okay, good. So what I'm about to give you today is more useful for people who aren't starting from scratch. And then also level of comprehension. When you first got this text, I guess this applies better to those of you who are starting from scratch. How many of you were able to read it and understand everything? Okay, good.
The Chinese?
The Chinese. How many of you were able to partially understand the text? Okay. Was there anybody who couldn't understand it at all? Okay. So what I'm about to say is more useful to people who are only able to partially understand the text. Okay, how to overcome comprehension issues. So those of you that understood some but didn't understand other parts, what did you do about the things that you didn't understand? Or anybody want to give me an example of something that you didn't understand when you were first reading the text? Yeah. Very good. Okay, I think that's the best method. Out of all the possible methods that there is, I think the context is your best friend. And context is something you can use for pretty much all texts, whereas other methods, such as using a dictionary, very often you won't be able to rely on in certain situations. Anybody else? Anybody want to give an example? Yeah.
There were some areas where it wasn't quite clear, so we had 3 native speakers of Chinese on our team.
Okay. Did they agree?
Most of the time, yes, but there were a couple of times that they kind of worked things out, like whether they were speaking or
What was one thing that you have to discuss? Okay. Okay.
Using that as Buddha-dharma to teach where Dharma is somehow. Another is that because my first information is that 至于 I know 的于 means additionally. Could you please give me delivery is leftover. So
Mhm.
they understand.
No.
So I want to here, and additionally, could you please hold and talk it down? So that's why we have.
Okay. Good.
I remember when you shared the meal first, and you gave us your
Yeah.
leftovers.
May we share your meal, or may you share the meal?
Oh, no, yeah, the English speakers then had to do a debate on, we don't really talk, English speakers don't speak in a certain way, so we had to sort of compromise with how we worded it out so that it honored the Chinese, but also wasn't maybe exact, but enough that when an English speaker would also make sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did everybody get this part about the Juyi? Okay, good. Let me focus on the Chinese for now, and then a little later I'll go on to the English part. So let's see, where was I? Comprehension issues. Oh, so what did you decide on in the end for Juyi?
Finally, I compromise.
How did you compromise?
Yes. We also went online and searched for some commentaries by other great masters and look at other translations as well.
Okay.
And
Did they help?
this is leftover, so I give you a.
Okay. you went with leftover because more people chose leftover.
Leftover, we just left it vague. We just say share the meal. Yeah, may we share the meal, right?
No, actually, originally I wanted to say maybe share the meal with you, and then the other Chinese speakers requested that we change it to will you share your meal with us. So that was
Okay.
the spirit of the meal.
But in terms of the G, if I understand it correctly, one interpretation of it was that could you give us the food that is left over, that's the G part, and then we'll take it over to the other world and use it to do good things. The second interpretation of G was could you give us some food, and the G, in addition, we'll do some good stuff. So the good stuff is not related to the food. And it looks like in the end you went with leftover for the G rather than an additional action as the G, right? And I think context-wise that makes better sense, right? Because there's no additional action. It's basically all about the food, right? Okay. So the context is a very good way to resolve questions that you might have. Any other groups with situations like this where there was text that you didn't fully understand? Yeah.
We had a translate expert that helped us very much.
Okay. What problem did you come across?
What does the census say? EJ, what does the census say about the leftover?
It's a remaining food.
Remaining.
Yeah. So we had some discussion about that. Could be when we say in English leftovers, the visualization that you said, the visualization that comes with when you just half eaten from the plate and there's something remaining. But neither the Chinese nor the Sanskrit have that specific meaning. Why would we choose that word in English with that limited meaning? It could be like we go to the dining hall here, and I have to take some food, and we eat the food. It doesn't count. Yeah, but it's
Reinforce the resolve for underdogs and motive. And make often the Buddha. We also have a debate because that's the pausing issue. In Chinese, the comma. You can use it in two ways.
Can you give us the Chinese text first?
Okay. 先发阿耨多罗三藐三菩提心，供养诸佛及诸菩萨。For the English, so I also have two interpretations. Number one is that it's parallel with two things. They reinforce the body resolve, and then they make the offer of Buddha and Bodhisattva. Number two, we have to master the thing. Reinforce the body resolve itself is a make offer of Buddha and Bodhisattva. So this happens a lot.
Yeah. You bring up a lot of really good points, which is that a lot of the disagreements isn't in the interpretation of the words themselves. It's in the relationship between the different words, whether they're parallel, whether they're they're supposed to be sequential, and that makes for different meanings, right? Good, good. Okay, let's move on, and then we'll have more time for this. So when you come across comprehension issues, you might look it up in a lexicon like a dictionary or Google. You might seek human assistance, ask somebody, ask a native speaker, or you could look at the context. And I think the most important tool is the third one, which you guys just mentioned. That is the context. Now, lexicons. I don't know if anybody consulted dictionaries, but I find that it's usually good for technical terms and established terms. It's not so good for newer terms, and it's not so good for terms that are idiosyncratic. Dictionaries tend to be very good for scientific and medical terms when you're translating these types of texts. A lot of my students basically just throw the entire text into Google Translate first. They might not produce a very good translation, but they'll help you save time on the technical words. I tried that for our Buddhist text and it didn't work. So for Buddhist texts, it's probably, at least for now, it doesn't work as well. Okay, you can seek human assistance, and it tends to be really fast, but then you're bound to a particular point of view, a particular person's point of view, which is why it's really nice to be able to use context. And context, I think, is one of the most useful things when you're learning language. I remember when I was teaching English in Taiwan, one of the problems that I came across was a lot of the students there who were speaking English as a second language, their understanding of words were not the same as I understood them because we acquired them differently. Think about how you learn the meaning of each word when you were a little kid. It comes to you gradually. You see the word used in different contexts and you guess. Your initial understanding of each word may not be the correct one, and psycholinguists have proven this to be true. But as you see the word used in more contexts, you get at the more adult meaning. And not only do you know the meaning of this word, you're familiar with all the different contexts that it appears in. You also have an idea of the frequency of which context this word appears more in. Okay, when you're learning it from a dictionary, you don't get any of that at all. So the context is really useful. Now, in this particular piece, if you have something that you don't understand, there are several different contexts that you could look to. What you were given was a part of a chapter, not the whole chapter, right? Did anybody go and read the whole chapter? In English? Okay. Was it useful? Was it useful? Did it help? Did it help you answer questions that you had when you were reading just part of the chapter?
I don't know that it helped me answer questions, but it gave me like the map of the terrain. So I kind of had a feeling for where we were going.
Okay.
So I started targeting words in that direction.
Okay, and then did you go on to read the entire sutra?
Yeah.
Okay. That would be another place to go. So we could look at the full context, we could look at the background information, the audience information, and the patron information. Okay, context. It might be useful to start with the full chapter, and then the full work. And when you're reading the full work, you might want to also consider other versions. Now, what you've been given is a Chinese translation of what purportedly was a Sanskrit sutra, right? And there are many Chinese translations of this sutra. In fact, a lot of people believe that this sutra developed over time. The earliest Chinese translation that we have now is by Zhi Qian. And then throughout the years, it became more and more complex. Things were added to it. The version that you were given was the version by Jiu Mo Luo Shi. That quickly became the most popular version. And because it was so popular, it's kind of like what happened with the Marquis Zhang version of the Analytes. A lot of the other versions were lost. So it's lucky that we still have the Zhi Qian version, but other versions, other translations of it into Chinese were lost. We also have a later version by Xuan Zhao, and then there's also a Tibetan version of the text. Okay, some of you may feel that it's easier to read an English translation. What I like to do is, if I'm translating the text into English, then I try not to read the English because I don't want to be affected by it. But if it's something that I don't plan to translate, then I find it's a lot easier to read an English version than a Chinese version, even if it's a modern Chinese version. What I often find is that in modern Chinese translations, The Chinese often melts into classical Chinese, so it's hard to see where the modern begins, where the classical ends, whereas you don't get that for English translations. And for this sutra, there are, I know, at least 5 different English versions that I've seen before. 2 of these are from the Tibetan, and then you have another 3 translated from the Chinese. Okay, background information. It might be useful to know who Vimalakirti is, right, when you're translating this. And you'll find that sometimes he is referred to by different names. And if you know more about him, then you'll know that it's the same person. Sometimes it's also useful to know a little bit about the translator, who Kumarajila is and what his style of translation is. And it might also be useful to know a little bit about the reception of the text. And then it's important when you're translating to know who you're translating for. What is the level of literacy of your audience? Are you translating for children or are you translating for adults? What is the intellectual background of your readership? Also, what is the level of dedication of your readership? Are you translating for a captive audience? Are you translating for people who have already decided that they want to study Buddhism? Or are you trying to convert somebody who is not interested in Buddhism? There's also the level of expertise. Are you translating for people who are already familiar with Buddhist theories, in which case you could use a lot of technical terms? Or are you translating for beginners, in which case you either have to explain or use terms that they understand? And then there's the cultural background of the reader. When you're translating between 2 different languages, the cultural backgrounds may be different. And in the end, like what I did with Confucius, I think it would be useful to have multiple versions for multiple readers. So I know that you're divided into groups, and each group is producing a version that's specific to that group, right? That's a wonderful thing to do, and I think through discussion with other people in your group, and perhaps intergroup discussion, you'll learn a lot. But I also think don't discard your original translation, because each of you comes from a unique linguistic and cultural background, and that version that you produce on your own may also be useful. So just as we're looking at the Kumarajila translation of this sutra, 100 years later, we may be looking at your translation or your translation. Some scholars may find that particularly useful. Okay, and then there's patron information. You might want to ask, why is it this sutra that we're translating? Which related works have already been translated by this institution? Which ones have not been translated? Does that figure into it? If this institution has already translated some related sutras, maybe you could look at how they translated these sutras, and that may be used to you. What is the purpose of this translation? Are you trying to produce an authoritative version, or is this an exercise in free translation, creative translation? What are the expectations, if there are any? Are you expected to follow a certain interpretive lineage, in which case you should look at references, or are you not? Okay, these all factor into your translation. Okay, you've all translated this text, so you know what it's about. Can somebody give me an oral summary of what this text is about? One of our translators. Somebody who's new to this.
The whole text is just a chapter.
Just the chapter you're translating.
So it starts because Shariputra was thinking about food.
Mm-hmm.
And so Vimalakirti to teach him kind of a little bit teases him, tells him that he shouldn't be thinking about food. Then he tells him that he's going to give him the best feast of his life. And so he creates a transformation Bodhisattva and shows the assembly that there's a lamb in the upper direction that has that is fragrant, that is made of fragrances, where everything is fragrant, and the food is really good. And so he tells the transformation Bodhisattva to go out and ask the Buddha to give them food, so he can teach by means of the food. And then Bodhisattva goes and does that, and that's how far we got.
Okay, terrific. Do people agree that that's a good summary? Okay. Let's think about what he told us and what he left out. He told us about Shariputra thinking about food and about Vimalakirti going in or creating this Buddha and bringing food from this other place, and then using food to teach them about the Dharma, right? So a lot of it is centered around this food thing, right? What has he left out?
Reading to Buddha in that land.
Okay, the greeting to the Buddha in that land. Also the distance between this world and the other world, right? Anything else?
None of the disciples were able to go to the upper realm to get the food. And then they were scolded that don't shame that none of you can do it.
Okay, good. That's very good. So,
They couldn't go to the Buddha lands was because they weren't bodhisattvas of that degree, that they were more focused on their personal self-cultivation, and that was their limitations. They didn't even know they could go to other lands for food.
okay, good. Now, I wanted to do this exercise because when you're doing an oral summary, you tend to preserve the core plot. You tend to preserve the skeleton of the story. So that was what he did. And I think that is a very important thing to remember. When you're writing and you're translating, you tend to lose sight of that. You tend to be focused on the words, and everything comes out in equal weight. So as you're translating, I think you should remember what was important in your oral summary and let that structure stand out. And then as that structure is in place, fill in the extra pieces of information and make sure that these extra details don't hijack the overall structure of the story. That would be important. Okay, so we have the main plot versus the peripheral information. Make a distinction there. In linguistics, we talk about iconicity and iconicity of weight or proportion, which is the more important the information, describe it using more words. The less important, describe it using less words. What we sometimes do in translation is, if the idea is very unfamiliar, we tend to devote more words to it, and if it's already familiar, we devote less words to it. But I don't think it should be decided by whether the idea is important. It should be decided by whether I don't think it should be decided by whether the idea is foreign or familiar. It should be decided by how important this idea is in the whole scheme of things. Okay, and the historical and cultural refractions, such as the sands in the 42 Ganges rivers, we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then what happens next in the story can also be important to how you understand it. Okay, let's look at your translations. Okay, let's start from the very beginning. Can people see the text here? I'll read it out loud then. You might not be able to see it, but since you've spent so much time on it, I think if I read it, you'll remember what it is. Okay, the very first line, 于是舍利弗心念，日时欲至，此诸菩萨当于何时? The first part, 于是. What does the 于是 mean here? Now, 于是 can be interpreted in different ways in Chinese, right? The most common interpretation is therefore. Now, therefore is the second part of a logical statement. I have a microphone in my hand, therefore you can all hear me. Okay, that's the therefore. However, this is the very beginning of this chapter, so there isn't something that it's immediately following, or if there was, you would have to look to the previous chapter to see what it was. But I read the previous chapter, and I don't think there is, in which case you probably shouldn't be using therefore for this, right? So some other options include then, and that is fine because then basically means at that place or at that time. Some of you use thereupon or at that time. These are some of the other options that I've seen that are okay. Yeah, so that is something to be careful about. Okay, the next thing to be careful about is what exactly is Shariputra asking? Okay, so it's almost noon. 此诸菩萨当于何时? What does 当于何时 mean? It's a question about food, but what's that question word? Okay, so there are maybe 6 question words. Who, what, when, where, why, how. Is it a who? Is it a why? Is it a when? Is it a where? Is it a how? Or is it a so what? Hmm? What or what's the second one? What's well? Oh, where? Okay. It's what or where. Okay. Now, you'll notice that in the Chinese, there is that yi, right? Yi is a preposition. It basically means at. So at can come before either a place or a time. If it's a what, why is there a yi? Can it still be what if there's a yi? Hmm? 当以何时, okay? But it's not an yi, right? So that would probably rule out the what if you were translating from the Chinese. In which case you could say, where are they going to eat? Or when are they going to eat? Which is more likely, which makes more sense? Where? Okay. Both are possible, but in the end, the important thing is it's all about food. So whether it's what you're going to eat, where you're going to eat, where you're going to eat, the mind is on food, and that's what the Buddha, that's what Vimalakirti is addressing, right? So technically, you should probably have something that works with the at, but in the bigger scheme of things, as long as it's a question about food, it'll work. It'll lead to what comes next. Okay, now the answer. Let me go down a little bit. 十维摩诘知其意而喻。佛说八解脱，仁者受行，起杂欲识而闻法乎? Okay, a couple of things I want to talk about here. The first is the 知. 知 is often a tricky word to translate when you go from Chinese to English or vice versa, because in Chinese, 知 can be either a state or a process, whereas in English, 知 is a state and not a process. Do people know what I'm talking about? So in English, either you know or you don't know. You can't be in the process of knowing. Whereas in Chinese, it can work both ways. So in English, if I were to say that after he knew that, let's see. Can't think of a good example right now. Never mind, let's go straight to this. So there's a few ways that you guys dealt with this. Group B says Vimalakirti knew what Shariputra was thinking. That's good because it's a state. At that time, Vimalakirti knew the intent of Shariputra. That works. And then the next group, then Vimalakirti recognized his concerns and responded. Okay, this is more of a process, but you changed the word, so that makes it work. The fourth column here, Vimalakirti instantly knew his thought and said. This is where it's a little borderline because it sounds like he's going from not knowing to knowing. If that's the case, then some adjustments might be needed. The translation from the Sanskrit, the last one is, then the Lichavi Vimalakirti encompassing the mind of the elder Shariputra with his mind and knowing it. Okay, as you can see, it's a very different content from what you're getting from the Chinese. Also, you'll see that when you're looking at translations from the Sanskrit or the Tibetan, you have that extra word, the, is it Lichavi? Lichavi, okay. Okay, and that's something that's explicit in the Sanskrit version, is it? And you don't see it in the Chinese, right? Okay. Okay, the next thing I want to ask you about is 仁者. This appears, I think, 2 or 3 times. What does it mean? Did anybody have trouble with this? I know I had trouble with this when I first encountered it. Now, Zhenzhe appears a lot in the Confucian Analects, but in the Analects, it means a compassionate person. It's usually seen as an ideal that people aim for. But that's not how this word is used here, because over here it's used more like a term of address. And descriptions are not the same as terms of address. Not all descriptions can be used as terms of address. Let me give you an example. Let's see. Who's a friend of yours here? Okay, you know him, right?
Yeah.
Is he a good person? Okay. Good person, can you come here? Good person. Grab that plant over there. Good person. Good person, stand up. Does that sound strange to you? Good person is a way to describe somebody. Good person is not a good way to address somebody, right? You never address somebody as good person. So the question here is then what do you do with this venture, which basically means good person, but you don't call people that. Did you have discussions about this in your group? Yeah. And what did you do?
A couple things were brought forward. One thought was that, oh, is there something that has a precedent in English and sounds kind of old-fashioned that would give it flavor? So I put forward benevolence, which does have precedent, or gentleman, which literally means pretty much the same thing as grandeur. Both of which were not acceptable, so we just went with kind of a very literal translation, benevolent.
Okay, and that you do see enough in Buddhist sutras to be able to use it, right? If you had to get rid of that, if you had to translate, let's say, for a modern audience, what would you do?
I would say good sir, probably.
You could use sir, or you could get rid of it altogether, right?
Say you.
Yeah. Okay, and then 佛说八解脱. Okay, most of you translated this as the eight liberations. 仁者受刑, 起杂欲识而闻法. Let me deal with this last part first, and then I want to link it with 八解脱. Okay, 杂欲识而闻法. 杂欲识, part of it is about thinking about food. Right? The other part is about learning the Dharma. Now, most of you have the meaning as it's stated in the source text. For example, group B, which is in the first column. So, Not that I know of, but you guys will probably know better. Is Zhenzhe used often in Buddhist text as a way to address people? Okay, thank you. Okay, so, yeah.
It seems to be some special term to show the respect for the Buddhist practitioner who have inside the higher level, in the sixth chapter. 它不是分众，不是凡众，仁者心。
Okay.
It's 仁者 to respect to people who has high stakes in the practice.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Also to show your courtesy before you approach someone.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so getting to the 杂欲识而闻法. Group B has, let's see, you are still thinking about eating while listening to the Dharma. Okay, you have the mixture of the two. Group C has mixed desiring for food while listening to the Dharma. That's fine. Now, the next group, Group D has, how could one only think of eating instead of contemplating the Dharma? That's a little bit different, right? That's not talking about mixing the two. It's talking about replacing the one with the other. And then my other question was, what's the relationship between the 八解脱 and the thinking about food and 文法? Is there something in your group you thought about? Yeah.
Yes. I thought because the Buddha already proclaimed the eight liberations, this is considered a list of Dharma. This is the food.
Okay?
Yeah. So it's really a contrast between that.
So you're saying that in the 8 liberations, you're not supposed to feast on actual food. You're supposed to only feast on Dharma. And yet here you are thinking about actual food. Okay. In that case, there's a link between the two. Right. So how come you're still thinking about eating while listening to the Dharma? Let me see. You have already accepted and put into practice the 8 kinds of... What's the best way to get this across? Do you think you need to explain the part of the 8 liberation that deals with the food to get the fact that...
Probably we do not need to.
Mhm.
Just consider the 8 liberation as, okay, this is the teaching, this is the
Mhm.
Dharma
Okay.
that Buddha proclaimed. Whatever Dharma, this is the food. This is the food for the mind.
But then you would have to assume that the reader already knows that the 8 liberations concerns not thinking about food, right?
Another approach you could take is, I think one of the 8 liberations is like liberation from reality or like sensual things like that. So
Mhm.
it's like since you're already liberated from this, why are you still thinking?
Okay. And is there any way you can build that into the language?
I think
I like what
Something like, yeah.
the first group said, how come you are still thinking, which to me suggests as a reader that there is a connection between the previous principle.
Yeah.
So even though I don't necessarily know what it is, I can surmise that, oh, okay, the 8 kinds of liberations have helped them to get over their desire for food.
Okay, good. That definitely helps. Okay, let me scroll down. Sure.
So in the Chinese, there's some ambiguity about the verb tense of
Mhm.
accept and practice.
Oh, okay.
And so now it's very difficult about that because the way we dealt with that as a group in group E is we thought that, okay, if he's prefacing that, if he's prefacing his approach with that, then that means that the Venerable Shariputra has already accepted and practiced
Mhm.
the 8 kinds of liberation. So how can we say about that? So that was our approach to deciding on the verb tense
Okay, good.
for that.
Yeah. I know what you mean. That would help too. And because you're emphasizing the acceptance and the practice, then mixing the food with the Dharma implies that it goes against your acceptance, or it goes against what you just accepted. Okay, I think we can see part of this. So this is the part where we talk about Vimalakirti going into Samadhi and then showing the audience this other world that is far away. Now most of you treated this pretty much the same way, although when we're talking about Bochu, some of you use Buddha lands, some of you use Buddha fields, some of you capitalized it, some of you did not. I don't know if there's a difference in this treatment. This is not something I'm very familiar with. Anybody want to comment on it? Or,
There is a style guide from TTS around capitalizations.
okay.
I think we try to avoid capitalizations for generalities and save for more
Got it. So this is more of a general term. Okay. And then we come to this kingdom, Zhongxiangguo, and over there you have this Buddha whose name is Xiangqi. When I first read it in Chinese, this is not a text I'm familiar with, so I was a little confused about the Xiang at first, but it was soon cleared up with the context. Xiang in Chinese can mean either fragrance, perfume, or it can mean incense, right? Usually incense is a noun, whereas fragrance or perfume is an adjective. But since over here it seems to be used more as a noun, I was leaning towards incense at first before I realized it was supposed to be the other. And most of you, I think, got this right without any problems. Next, we come to the name of the country and the name of the Buddha. Okay, so you more or less did it the same way. Most of you called the country, let's see. I should put that. Okay, so you have multitude of fragrance for the country, and then accumulation of fragrance for the Buddha. First question, fragrance or fragrances? Does it make a difference?
Accumulation, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
How so?
Could be many types of smells which are good, or just one.
Do you say different types of fragrance, or do you say different types of fragrances?
Exactly.
Both is fine.
Okay. Are there any differences in connotation?
I think if you pluralized it, like I begin to think of a perfume store where you're actually like looking at individual fragrances.
Exactly.
Whereas if you just said many, like a multitude of fragrance, now I'm imagining walking through a market and I just, like they're not individualized in the same kind of way.
Yeah, I feel the same way. So for me, fragrance in the singular is more of an abstract notion of smell. Whereas fragrances with the S does make me lean towards perfumes, like in a perfume store sometimes. So there is a slight difference there, but not that any of these would be wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4, B, C, D, E. Group E has a country called Myriad Fragrances, and then the Buddha is named perfumed with fragrances. And another version would be collection of supreme fragrances. How did you arrive at these names?
We're the group that's perfumed with all fragrances, and I think we misunderstood because TJ told us, he said, oh, the Sanskrit is more like this, so we went with that, but obviously we confused the name of the Buddha. You can see that the name of his Buddha system is fragrant with all fragrances, so we obviously got confused and switched them. Yeah.
Okay. Within your group discussions, has anybody ever thought of doing it differently?
We had a debate between collection of fragrances and accumulation of fragrances. But it basically the 3 or 4 members that really like accumulation swayed the others because they said it's not just a bunch of random fragrances. It's more like it's such an abundance and they keep gathering layer upon layer.
Okay.
It's all based on the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Because that works. So accumulation.
No.
And I needed accumulation because accumulation makes me think of the stock market and snow.
Okay. Now, yeah.
We use that when it comes to color and choosing what would be a good way.
Okay.
Like, just a very literal meaning of what I saw in the Sanskrit. What the word is going to Buddha. And Buddha, you can say it's a fire or heat. But very literally, what it means when you gather stuff, right? The end product of your gathering. If it's leaves, then what you gather leaves and what you get is.
Okay.
So, change.
Now, you guys have some minor differences in wording, but you're pretty much taking the same approach, which is to translate pretty much literally from the Chinese and preserve the imagery. Now, I listed 5 English translations earlier. In the first 2 that are listed, that are given on the list, they went with not a semantic translation, but a transliteration from the Sanskrit. So I don't think I can pronounce the names, but in their translations, they basically gave a long country name with no image. Has anybody ever thought of doing that? Or has anybody thought about using a word that sounds more like a country name? I don't know of any countries called multitude of fragrances. Anybody tried that? I mean, you would have to come up with something that preserves the image without sounding too kitschy.
There is Kandahar in Afghanistan. The name comes from Kandahar. The name of this land is
Okay, interesting. That could be another way to think about it. Okay, let me move on. I think we're running out of time. similar issue is this. So in this other land, there are no Shengwen and there are no Bizhifu. In this situation, all of you went with transliteration. So no Sravakas or no Pratya Buddhas. In some of the other translations that I saw, some people did differently. Some people said there were no disciples and there were no solitary sages. That would be another way to think about it. Is this something that you discussed in your groups?
Yes.
Okay, and then what made you decide on this?
So we realized that we were using Bodhisattvas in that sentence, and so we keep it all consistent and straight.
Okay, good. That would be pretty good reasoning. Okay, now let's move on. This is one area where some of you had differences. So, 有诸天子皆好相言. What is this 天子? Some of you call them heavenly princes. Some of you went with Givas. Some of you use heavenly beings, celestial beings. What else do we have? Gods. Okay. Any differences between these? Do you think that the choice your group made is better than the choice made by another group? What is your reason?
I feel okay with like Deva's heavenly princes and celestial beings. Sorry, Deva's heavenly beings and celestial beings, but I would hesitate over princes because I don't know the structure of the royalty in heaven. So I don't know what their rank is.
Okay. What is it supposed to mean? This is something that I don't know the answer to. Yeah.
Actually, I'm totally the opposite. Cancer shouldn't mean heavenly beings. Because if that's the case, it should be Tianren. Cancer means the kings of the heavens. King. That's why we went through the president. Yes, the kings of the heavens.
So the way Tianzi is usually used in Chinese.
Yes.
Tianzi. But isn't there only one Tianzi in the normal?
There are many heavens, so each heaven has a king, so there are two heavens.
Okay, I see. And let me see. You'll notice the Anodolo Samuel Samputi, which all of you produced using a transliteration. But the Sanskrit version, does the Sanskrit version have that?
It says, it says Mahayana.
It says Mahayana instead, okay. And I think in the Tibetan version, I did not see this term used, so it's probably phrased differently. Okay. Now let's go to this part where, let's see, where Vimalakirti says everybody is shameful. Okay, and he says, 谁能治彼佛犯? What does it mean, 治彼佛犯? So some of you said, who will go ask for food, who can go to that Buddha land to get food, who is able to request the meal from that Buddha land, who can go to that Buddha for food. So there are slight differences in all of these, right? To request the meal from that Buddha land kind of means you're going to take away their meal. Whereas for some,
We wanted to be polite. We felt like go
okay.
get food is just like so rude. Like it's like when you get takeout from the Buddha land.
But then you're taking the whole meal and not just part of it, not just the leftovers.
We're going to request the meal. I see. Actually request the meal instead of part of the meal. Or
Yeah.
I see your point.
Whereas if you say food, then it doesn't have to be an entire meal. And who can go to that Buddha for food? So the food that that Buddha gives you might not be his meal. He might have some other food somewhere that he's going to give to you. So these are things you can think about, how best to represent this. And then you have the part where 以文书师力为神故, and everybody was silent. What's the relationship between this? So did he use his powers to prevent people from speaking? Or is it because he was so powerful that everybody dared not speak?
They were in awe.
Okay. Mhm.
like to show off in front of Manjushri Bodhisattva.
Okay.
That's the great
I think in the commentaries both. So Manjushri used the power to like carry state island, and then they also feel great. So it's both in our commentary.
So in Group B's translation, due to Manjushri's awesome spiritual power, it sounds like he's exerting his spiritual power. So people are not speaking. Yeah.
So actually, we were discussing this, and I think we went through the commentary, and what we found was that there was, according to one commentary, what happens is that Manjushri used his power to make everybody silent for two reasons. Because it would be rude for the guest, instead of the host, to get food, and also so that he could reveal the virtue of humanity. So what we did is that we put that information in a footnote so that reader can understand. Because it's hard to know what's going on.
Okay. And does the Sanskrit version shed any light on this? Does it word it differently?
It just says through his accomplishment. Not even he didn't do it because of his highly accomplished meditation. They were not able to do it.
Thurman's translation actually says restrained by Manjushri's spiritual power. So he's very explicit that comes from the Tibet. So that interpretation at least is that Vimalakirti is very consciously keeping everyone silent.
Okay. That's useful to know. Okay, let's move on. I just wanted to point out something here that's interesting when you look at the Sanskrit version. Over here it says 于是维摩诘不起于坐 and then 居众会前化作菩萨. So he didn't rise from his seat is what the Chinese is saying, right? In the Sanskrit version, your translation is different. It says Vimalakirti without getting up from his bed. And yeah, you want to say?
After you mentioned it, we had looked it up. But then the context, the situation, Vimalakirti, it's not a debate or a normal. Debate is actually in here. He's ill, but it's precisely sick. So they have all come there and he's full of sick bed and he's talking to them.
Right.
Anyways, the word is listed like a place where you lie down, bed where you lie down.
Yeah.
And that's also like cultural contextual basis about old times. Like weren't some of the beds like a Vedic style where you could understand or lie on them?
Okay, that could be a way around it. But here you do have a little problem of sorts. Okay, and then okay, here I want to talk a little bit about pragmatics. So this Buddha that Vimalakirti produces, he goes to this other world, and when he goes to that other world, he has to be polite. So he goes through all these rituals with this Buddha from that other world, right? The question is, do you translate everything? If you do, it becomes a little bit tedious, and it may distract the reader. If you don't, then you might be missing something. So if you compare the different English translations, some of them simplify this somewhat, and some of them keep everything. In fact, if you compare the different Chinese translations, that happens also. Now, the part where it says 致敬无量，问讯起居，少病少恼，气力安步. Some of you translated this more literally. Some of you used a more pragmatic approach. Let's look at some of these examples. Let's see. Okay, Group B, the first one. Do you have few worries? Do you have few illnesses? Okay, this is literal, but it's a strange way to ask people whether they're well. If I were to come to your house and ask you if you're well, have you had only 3 flus? Have you had only 2 stomach aches? That would be an odd way to ask, right? When you say have you had few worries, it assumes that there have been worries. So how would you ask somebody about their health? Is your health good? Okay. And is there any way you could perform this ritual by mentioning illness or worries?
these were traditional and formulaic questions that you asked, particularly to the class that the Buddha was in Indian society. This was how you were supposed to address the Buddha, was with this series of formulaic questions that would always be the same in every case. So there's this cultural gap here of these are apparently representing exactly the questions that would have been asked of the Buddha, presumably of his class in Indian society and stuff like this. And so preserving that, on the one hand, the cultural aspects, or preserving this, the naturalness of the exchange is something that needs to be compromised.
Yeah, to a scholar who wants to know the literal wording of it, this might be useful. But to somebody who is not familiar with these terms of address, then this would come out as less natural. How about asking something like, have you been free from illnesses? Have you been free from worries? Yeah.
This part actually our group in TV will discuss it. Indeed, it's not free from. 少病少扰 is not 无病无恼.
Right.
If you say 无病无恼, that's free of. 少病少 is still.
But the problem with that is that people in English don't ask 少病少恼.
And also, what he said, indeed, this is in the Buddhist sutras, it's a convention of when Buddhas, great Buddhas, they use exactly those words, multiple times, not just here. And usually there's another one that's missing here, 少病少扰气力安排, and another one is 众生异度from. So this is not just something that's singular only in this sutra. It's exactly the same phrases appear in other places too. So maybe, just as you said, maybe we should add some footnote indicate this is some cultural thing.
That would be helpful. Yeah.
I think your earlier point about really thinking about the target audience is really important, because if this is for a group of serious Buddhists who really want to know exactly what the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas said according to the sutra, then they want it to be very literal and very specific. But if this is somebody who is just kind of like a passing lay person and they've never read the sutra before and it's their first encounter, maybe they don't need the same level of detail. So I think audience is really important.
There ought to be different versions for different audiences. Yeah. I think.
Realizing that there's a third purpose, the CPTV purpose, at least for the Sanskrit translation. In this case, the purpose is to assist the Chinese translation.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, for example, let's say you have a proof, but when the time comes you have it, that's if the final product or English translation, that's how the Sanskrit will be translated. But you want to see if there's any difference in meaning that I don't know what the Chinese says. So then the appropriate moment arrives, keeping it more literal so that the Chinese can use it. So it's a whole third aim for the
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in one of my other talks I mentioned how with translations of the Bible, you have different degrees of literalness, you have different versions for different audiences. It might be useful if for some of these Buddha sutras, the same could be done. Yeah.
Based on today's question, I have a follow-up question, which is, what we're translating is already a translated text.
Yes.
It's not an original one. So, given that we also have the Sanskrit version, there have been times when we've had to make choices regarding, whether to follow the Chinese or the Sanskrit, because it might be clearer or something in Sanskrit. And then we're not, completely translating just from the Chinese. So what's your opinion on, sort of trying to be more holistic about it versus more precise and just sticking to the Chinese?
It depends on which hat I'm wearing. If I'm wearing the hat of a lay reader, then I probably want something that reads smoothly and probably something that's based on just one version. If I'm wearing the hat of the scholar, then I probably would like something like Etienne Lamott's translation, which is based on the Tibetan, but it also takes into consideration Chinese versions. So you have larger text that's based on the Tibetan version, and in smaller text it shows the variants that appear in the other versions. That might be a good way to do it. Yeah.
And our group struggled a lot with whether it's third person or like second. So he's telling the the Bodhisattva to say what he's telling him. So we add I Vimalakirti, I'm here to pay.
Yes.
And in group C, they're like, he would like to request for remaining food. So
Oh, okay.
we use I or third
We
person.
talked about this,
Mhm.
about Bodhisattva's transformation body. It can be interpreted both ways. It can be, actually it's the same person, the same Bodhisattva, like when Bodhisattva have different transformation bodies, and this transformation body is like Bodhisattva.
Okay. I think we have two slightly different questions here. You're talking about this 画作
She was talking
Yeah.
about the one who use I when you
Yeah.
speak.
Mhm.
So it can be, it was a person. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Whether it's he or I.
Okay. In that case, we have four possibilities, I think. Okay. The first question to consider is this Bodhisattva that's created. Is it a different entity or is it himself? That's one question we need to answer. 化作菩萨, does it mean himself becomes this other thing? Or does it mean that he created a different thing? And the second question, I think, has to do with whether to use a direct quote or an indirect quote for recorded speech. So when that Buddha is speaking, does the Buddha say, I want this, or should we say, he says? And for the first question, I don't know. I don't have enough Buddhist knowledge to know whether it's himself or another entity. What do you people think? In your group, you believe that it was the same. It was Vimalakirti himself.
Because this transformation body is representing the person.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
it referred to Vimalakirti as him.
Okay.
But then we thought we did both ways to
Which group is yours?
be.
B. Okay. So that would
sorry,
C. Okay. That would say, so Vimalakirti says, once you arrive there, pass on what I'm saying now. That seems to be two different parties, right? I would be Vimalakirti, and then you is the Buddha that he created. Okay.
Then there's also the interpretation of, even if it is the same person in two different bodies,
Mhm.
that Vimalakirti would be going through this process of relaying this message for the sake of the audience.
Mhm.
You know, and so it's not that in Vimalakirti's mind he's talking to a separate being, but that he's having this conversation just to teach everyone else.
Okay. And if that's the case, would it be possible to just treat it as a second entity?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Because it's like it's been a clone.
yeah.
Or is it an actual extension of it, like an antibody part or a prosthetic or
Mhm.
even like some other part of him that is connected to him, but he's sent it out and it comes back.
Mhm.
Then I think it's kind of both. Like,
Okay. From the wording, it sounds like they're distinct enough that he can be speaking to him and instructing him to do something for him. Okay, let's try to wrap this up. One last thing before we finish. 令此乐小法者得弘大道. So what exactly is this 小法 and what exactly is this 大道? A lot of you went for a literal translation. So for the 小法would be what do you have? Small dharma or lesser teaching, and then for 大道 you have the great path. But in some other translations, you have it interpreted somewhat differently. Some people interpret this 小法 as Hinayana, and then the 大道 as Mahayana. Did this come up in your discussions? And what did you decide?
I mean, we used those when we delayed self-cultivation instead of, because sometimes it's a little loaded when Mahayanas talk about Theravada Buddhists or whatever. So we wanted to sort of be more respectful to the Theravada tradition. So we opted for self-cultivators as opposed to people who cultivate for the great life for everyone. So that's sort of how we thought about it in terms of also thinking about the politics between the two sects of Buddhism.
Okay.
Right. So we didn't want to be like insulting
And between the 小法 and the 大道, okay, 大道 is what you're aiming for. Do you think the 小法 is treated as something negative here? Should it have some negative connotation? Which is what happens in some other. I'm asking this because if you look at, let me go here.
I don't know if it's negative so much as like level.
We're limited.
It's like if you want to do the breakaway, you want to go to the next level. But the other dharma is like, it's a pretty high level. It's just there's nothing beyond.
So in the Thurman translation, what you have is the inferior ways for 小法 and great intelligence for 大道. So I think there is some negative connotation in the inferior ways. Okay.
Or it's like it's a limited practice because of its emphasis only on oneself rather than all of the things.
Or if you think about like in Hinayana case, smaller vehicle can carry a few people, but a larger vehicle can let everybody across. I like that image.
Okay. All right, and I think we're half an hour over our allotted time.